Kansas School for the Deaf. And Angie, thank you so much for being here today, even though I started by calling you Andy.
Not a problem at all.
The interesting thing is several of my committee members are also in public health, and this morning, so 3 of you, yeah, we called one gentleman, what, 3 different names? So I'm just keeping it going for today. I apologize, but thank you for being here.
You are welcome, and thank you, Madam Chair and distinguished members of the committee. I'm, like you said, I'm Angie Walker, the coordinator of the Language Assessment Program for children who are deaf and hard of hearing in Kansas. And thank you for the opportunity to share our annual report for fiscal year 2021. So as you know, Kansas, we have a very strong newborn hearing screening program. We're fortunate to have a strong network of early intervention providers to work with children who have disabilities. And our teachers, our service providers and administrators in the state, they strive to lead the world for the best success for education for each child in Kansas. But despite our great programming and all of our best efforts, our deaf and hard of hearing children are still being left behind. The Language Assessment Program, Deaf of Hard of Hearing, or LAP, DHH, it provides a vital service that allows professionals who have the training, the experience, and the expertise in the unique needs of children who are deaf and hard of hearing and their language assessment. And it allows us to collaborate and support those children's families, their teachers, their providers, and their school districts. You may recall from previous presentations that we know early fluent communication is critical and essential to typical cognitive, social, and emotional development of any child. We also know that children who are deaf and hard of hearing frequently do not have access to that language, or at least not full access, whether it be signed or spoken. And this can cause interruptions in the natural development of their language. So the purpose of LAP DHH is to assess, monitor, and track the language development of all deaf and hard of hearing children ages birth through 8 throughout the state. This includes children, not only children who are receiving special education services, but it may be a child who is not receiving any additional services. It could be a child who uses American Sign Language. It could be a child who uses a different spoken language. Could be a child who has a very mild loss on one side or a profound loss in both ears. So we're looking at all children throughout the state who have a hearing loss. And the intent is to provide the data that's necessary to determine whether our current interventions are effective and should be continued, or whether alternative interventions should be considered. So before sharing our methodology and our current findings, I want to clarify that this year's report, we based our numbers on the state fiscal year, whereas in the past we had used a calendar year. So I know that you were probably up late last night comparing my reports from previous years. I just want to assure you that's why there's a difference in numbers. All right, so from July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021, 102 deaf and hard of hearing children were assessed through the LAP. 62 of those children were birth to 3, 27 were 3 to 5, and 13 were 5 through 8. We use a very specific assessment process, which includes obtaining and analyzing one or more language sample, using different language development checklists and or standardized language assessments. The assessments are administered in the child's home or in their school environment. A few cases they were administered virtually. And all of the assessments were administered and then analyzed by LAP DHH specialists who have been trained in the specific administration of those assessments. So using the results of the assessments, then we complete what we call a language milestones document, and we use that to indicate whether or not a child is meeting their language milestones, whether it be in ASL, English, or both languages. So the results I'm presenting today are based on that document, and they represent the collected data of all of the children who have been assessed. Now, of course, that individual data is also shared with the family and any kind of school teachers or providers so that they can look at that individual child and help that child, but this is the collective data. So again, 102 children were assessed, and 80% did not meet age-appropriate milestones in either ASL or English. So that leaves 20% who did meet age-appropriate milestones in one or both language. 45 children were assessed in ASL. 89% did not meet their milestones. 92 children were assessed in English, and 80% did not meet their milestones. And of those children, 12 had an identified additional disability, which in theory then would indicate that the remaining children do not have any other type of cognitive disability or other disability that would affect their language development. And these results have been consistent since the beginning of the program. Now, the statute also requires our annual report to include existing data from the state performance plan on pupils with disabilities. And we get this data directly from the Department of Education. The portion of the performance plan that's most relevant to LAP is indicator 7B1. And that looks at the percent of preschool children ages 3 through 5 with IEPs who demonstrate improved acquisition and use of knowledge and skills, including early language communication and early literacy. So during the 2021 school year, when looking at preschool children whose primary or secondary disability was not deaf or hard of hearing, results indicated that 88.87% of preschool children demonstrated improvement. When looking at children whose primary or secondary disability was deaf or hard of hearing, 88.89% demonstrated improvement. Well, those numbers are very similar and actually look quite good. However, there are several caveats that we need to consider when analyzing this data. The state performance plan is only looking at, this particular plan is only looking at children from ages 3 to 5, whereas LAP we're looking birth through 8. The state data is comparing students who are deaf and hard of hearing with other children who have disabilities, while ours looks at the language development of deaf and hard of hearing children compared to what is expected of typically developing children. And then finally, the state data looks at demonstrated improved acquisition and use of any knowledge and skills. And this does include early language and communication, but it's not limited to language development, whereas LAP DHH looks primarily at language growth. So these caveats are important to consider when we compare the numbers because we're not looking at exactly the same group of children, nor are we comparing the exact same skills. So while it appears as though using that data, it can appear that our deaf and hard of hearing children are making a similar amount of progress or improvement compared to same age peers with disabilities. Upon analysis, we can see that in fact our deaf and hard of hearing children are not developing at a rate that would be expected. And this is just one example that draws attention to the need to use specific assessments to monitor language development of our deaf and hard of hearing children, as well as the need for in-depth analysis by professionals who have that unique training for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. There are services and screenings in place throughout the state, but they're not meeting the needs of this particular group of children, which is actually what led to the statute to begin with. So limited access to language, whether it be signed and or spoken, is a primary factor in causing the language delay in deaf and hard of hearing children. The potential impacts of these delays have a significant long-reaching effects. They can have negative effects on a child's social emotional well-being, their disposition, their cognitive ability, and the ability to be a contributing taxpaying citizen. So while the data that we're collecting is very disheartening, we remain passionate about the program, recommending the appropriate interventions so that children who are on target remain on target, and that the children who are delayed receive the support that they need to show appropriate language development. The lab supports families and local service providers and teachers by identifying the language needs of their deaf and hard of hearing children, as well as suggesting interventions that can be implemented to prevent these language delays from developing in the first place. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to stand for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Angie. What questions do we have? Yes, Senator Dietrich, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you so much for this information. It was very well presented. So what are the things that we can do to help our children who are deaf and hard of hearing get the resources and experiences that they need to be able to become more proficient? I mean, I'm kind of looking for a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator, for the question. The main question, or the main answer, is to get language access. Let these children have access to language. So if children have hearing devices like hearing aids or cochlear implants and they want to use spoken English, we need to make sure that those implants and hearing aids are working and that the children are using them and the parents know strategies to use them. When we have children who use ASL, we need to have parents who can learn ASL. We need to have opportunities to support parents in learning ASL so that the children can have access to the same information that hearing children have access to every day of their lives. Does that answer your question?
It's fine if you want to give a follow-up.
Thank you. Yes, it does. I'm just wondering if you were to prioritize what we needed to do first, is there one that is more important than another? And how can we help you?
Mm-hmm. Again, thank you. I'll be honest that when I prepared this for today, it was specifically to talk about the result of the assessments, which is the point of the statute. But that's the next step, and that is something that we need to discover. If we could have ASL classes available to families in every, obviously not in every community, but in communities throughout the state, I think that would be wonderful. I think that if children who were in school could be educated together amongst their deaf and hard of hearing peers, that would go a long way because they could have access to children who are like them, access to teachers who can provide the ASL support and the English support. And I don't mean by that to come to the school for the deaf. I just mean that larger school districts might have the opportunity to have programs within their schools where the deaf and hard of hearing children go, so that we're saving resources on interpreters, we're saving resources on teachers of the deaf, and so forth.
Next question, Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for being here. Back to your report, you mentioned in the report how about the acquisition and use of knowledge and skills of language, and so the School for the Deaf is comparing to full population. Is that correct?
These test results are.
I'm sorry. Okay. In the test results are comparing to full population, whereas the Department of Education is comparing to other disabled children. And so I'm trying to understand: is there a belief that they're different, but I'm not sure I understand why you feel that comparing to the full population is a better measurement than comparing to other disabled children.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator. To be very blunt about it, our children who are deaf and hard of hearing, we don't consider them as being disabled, and we want to have the same expectations for them and for their language development as we would have for any typically developing child. And if we're comparing these children to children who do have additional disabilities, whose growth may be slower or may be different, and our growth may be slower and look different, but then they look the same versus where we really think that they should be.
Follow up?
I can understand that, but the reality is if a deaf and hard of hearing child is going to get any kind of service, they're going to be identified. So that does put them into a category, whether, you know, I mean, nobody really likes to be in a category, but it does in order to avail of services. And so I guess that then begs the question of saying, you don't want them to be in this category, even though they have to be in this category. And so I guess I can understand why, you know, the two different ways of using the tools. So there will always be that difference of how those are used, because every child that's in this category of a disabled child, the range of whatever that disability can be very wide, from a speech issue to total body immobility. So I think that would be true for almost any disability, that they're going to have to be categorized. They're going to have to be labeled in order for that you to receive services. Would you agree?
Yes, may I respond? Yes, thank you very much for asking that question, because I want to be clear that I'm not saying that they shouldn't be labeled or that they shouldn't even be considered in those assessments. I think that that is appropriate. What I'm saying is if that's the only assessment tool that we're using, or assessments like that, then it can sell our children short, because it doesn't show where they need to be and where they can be if they have language access.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions, committee? Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was noticing on the chart that in the blue for 2019, it shows only 11 children were evaluated, comparing to 69 and then 102. Can you tell me why that is?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator. We have been phasing in the program because it's quite a large program. We estimate that there are about 772 children throughout the state. And to do this type of assessment and really analyze this language development, I mean, it can be time-consuming, and KSD was designated as the lead agency. We did not have any money to start, but we absorbed the costs of that. So the first 3 years, employees of KSD who already had full-time jobs took this on, and we couldn't take on more than that, essentially. So that's one reason. Then the other reason is we started with children who we already knew were there, who were already in our early intervention services. So we were starting with them, and then as those children aged up, then they remained in the program. Then we hired somebody who works in Wichita, so we were able to reach more children. This year we hired somebody who lives in Manhattan, so we're able to reach more of the children in the western part of the state. So that is what it was intended to grow, to be implemented in phases.
And how many children do you have now that you anticipate being measured in 2022?
Thank you. I do not have the exact number in front of you or in front of me. I know that our goal is 250, but I don't have the data of where we're at today.
How many children are in the school?
In our school, about 150.
Okay, so the 250 would be, as you said, across the state?
Right. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind, let's see here. I apologize.
Okay.
So for this report, sorry, I did not emphasize this information. So 62 children who were assessed in in fiscal year 21, 62 were in Sound Start services. So that means they are all around the state. 13 children received specialized services through their home school district or did not receive any services. And then 25 of those children attended KSD. So only 25 in this number were from KSD. We are seeing, I mean, the majority of the students that we're seeing right now are throughout the state.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Rob, did you have any questions? Okay. One of the questions that I would like to ask is, are you able to provide us with a map as to where are the pockets where, are there particular pockets in the state where children are meeting the expectation? Or was it scattered throughout the population? So 20 of the 102, so 20%, or 21% of the students that were surveyed are meeting those benchmark expectations. So is that sprinkled throughout the state, or is that in a particular pockets or areas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's also a great question. At this time, I don't have that information. I can tell you where the pockets are where children are located, and I do have a map and can get you a map for that. But I don't think we have enough data yet to, I think it's too sparse to be able to identify that these children are in a particular area. I don't think we have that information yet.
And I understand it's a small sample, but as you look at the 3 years, so we have 36 children that were identified as meeting the benchmarks for their age. So did we look to see if there's any overlap of areas where we take, here are the 4 from the first year, here are the 12 from the second year, here are the 20. Are we able to see any consistency? Or is that something that we can get? I guess what I'm trying to really drive at is the location of the child kept confidential or removed from the collection of the data? So are we just collecting the raw data, but it's not tethered to a location?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We do through our database. I mean, I can access that. And again, I have not done that yet. I do think that is something that we can look at. It's just not something we have analyzed yet.
Okay. And I'll follow up with, so what percentage of the 102 that were evaluated, what percentage of them have some type of a device like the cochlear implant or a BAHA or hearing aids?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, we are collecting that information, but I don't have the specific data analyzed yet on that. We were slow on getting that information from the beginning, and so we're kind of playing catch up on that. So that, again, will be data that I can look at in future years, but I don't have right at this moment.
Is that data collected and it just hasn't been tabulated from the prior 3 years?
Both. It's that it hasn't been tabulated, and it's also that when we started, we needed to improve our system.
So, go ahead, Senator Petty.
Thank you. I don't know, I guess I think it's along the lines of Senator Baumgartner, but of those 62 children that receive Sound Start services, who's providing the Sound Start services?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator. I can't answer that definitively because our Sound Start team, they vary. So they work with the local Tiny K networks, and they vary in the amount of support that they are asked to provide. So some may be seen, twice a month. Others may be on consult and seen once a quarter.
Thank you. So, so this I think you really did answer the question for me. So those Sound Start services, I'm not really interested in the amount because I know that would vary from child to child, but those are being provided through Tiny K. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. May I? Yes, so at this moment, they are. We are expanding our program to where now if there are children who are not receiving services from a Tiny K network because of their parents or their families' request, we are now at the point where we are hoping to reach those children as well. But currently, yes, the children that we have seen were in a Tiny K network.
Follow up again on Tiny K.
Sorry, I just thought.
That's okay.
So in most, and I'll just use these numbers because they're your numbers, but like with those 62 children that are getting their Sound Start services through Tiny K, do you usually find that Tiny K is the vehicle that, or like that in their community, is the vehicle for early identification for you to then make the contact? Or are families coming directly to the school for the deaf and then being sent back or given information about within their local community? How does that usually work?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator. So we actually are getting our data now from Sound Beginnings, the newborn hearing screening. Now, we are working very closely with the Department of Health and Environment with the lady who runs the Tiny K. I guess I don't know exactly what her position is, but yes, we are working with her to help identify the right people that we need to contact within those Tiny K networks and so forth. Because like I said, so far we have known these children, who they were, where they were, they had sought out our services. Whether it be from the Tiny K network or a family, I don't know that I don't know that I have that information. But from here on out, we will definitely be relying on them to help us make those contacts.
Thank you.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have actually two separate questions. First of all, in your chart, how many of those children assessed were from, say, the western half of the state?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator. I do not have that in front of me. I would be happy to run that data and get that for you.
And then a separate question. In the conclusion of your presentation here, you talk about the access to these language services. How do you think that masking children and masking preschool and school-age children will show up in the data in the years to come as far as language development?
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's a very interesting question, and obviously I can't give any kind of answer with any kind of definitive or any definitive response, but it plays a part in language acquisition. I mean, our facial movements, if we're using English, we're using our lips and our facial expression. If we're using American Sign Language, much of the grammar is on the face, so it will have an impact. I don't know what kind of impact, but it will.
I do want to follow up with a few things, because those of us that were in public health this morning, the hearing was on a bill as far as the testing that is done on newborns. Now, we were dealing with the heel stick and then the lab tests that are run. But it is also, in that same legislation, it's been mandated of the hearing test on all newborns. So those 772 children that you talked about, that population of deaf and hard of hearing, were most all of them identified with that newborn screening? Either they're at the hospital or the follow-up a couple weeks later, once some of that amnio fluid had kind of moved its way out?
Yes, ma'am. So To be clear, the 772 students aren't necessarily identified. We used numbers that we got from Sound Beginnings to project because we don't know exactly how many children are out there. But yes, the numbers that we did use to make that projection were from the newborn hearing screening.
And there are going to be children that develop hearing issues. It could be from an illness at infancy or at some point as they grow older. It could be an injury that causes that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So what I really want us to try and get to is one other question, and I'm not sure that I have the letters right. Is it EES, Exact English?
Oh, SEE, Signing Exact English.
Sign exacting, okay. Is that still being used in the Wichita School District?
I don't know whether it is or not. I can tell you that we have not yet encountered a child who is using C that we have had to evaluate. But I do not know what the percentage of use is throughout the state or in Wichita.
Do you know of any school district, we know that we have some school districts, primarily our larger districts, that have a separate school that is a bilingual school or, a bilingual school where they might be, part of what they're teaching the children is English and English grammar, as well as Chinese or something like that. I know one of the school districts in my Senate district is offering that. So do we have any schools in any of our school districts where the two languages are English and ASL?
Not to my knowledge, but that's a very intriguing idea. I mean, only to the extent of like ASL being offered as a second language. That's the only thing that I know. Of course, the School for the Deaf is a bilingual school, ASL and English.
But for some of these children, it would actually be, English would be that second language. So depending on what the background is of the student population, one would be the primary, the other would be the secondary. Do we know how many school districts are providing signing in the classroom for children?
No, ma'am, I do not. I will look to see if I can find that information, but I'm not certain that I would be able to access that.
So when I look at your conclusion, and I think that Senator Dietrich talked about this as well, is that whole issue. So if we have limited access to language and communication, that means the parents, if they're not deaf or hard of hearing or have not been in an environment where they have perhaps learned ASL, they would be learning that language as well to be able to then share that with their children that might be deaf or hard of hearing. So it's access not just for the child, but for those that the child is living with. So, one of the interesting things that was communicated this morning is what the Department of Health hopes to do in the future is when a diagnosis, a preliminary diagnosis is made through the heel stick and the lab testing, that parents then be given information about where to go for resources. We know that when the audiologist or the audiologist assistant does that hearing test, typically they give a sheet and for the parent before they leave the hospital that says, if it's a negative result, then you need to meet with a pediatrician or have some type of within a couple weeks. So is there any specific information that is given to parents when there's been that identification of them, of the child either being deaf or hard of hearing, this is where to go for resources? Or are parents left to just kind of try and navigate that on their own?
Thank you. So I don't know exactly how it is passed out, but yes, I do know that Sound Beginnings, the newborn screening program, does pass on information. Like I said, I don't know exactly how. I do know that families are extremely overwhelmed, when they have a child who's identified. So yeah, I think that they have it, but I don't know that it's necessarily accessible at that time for other reasons.
And I guess I'll just make this observation. I don't think we're really, I don't think we could really say that we know where resources are in our state for ASL training for families. Would that be a correct assumption?
Probably, or there are very little resources.
So it seems to me, even though the Department of Health makes sure that that infant newborn testing occurs, there is a gap of communication, and I would say very similar, or not unsimilar, from what we heard 2 weeks ago from the superintendent from the School for the Blind. I think you'll remember he identified, this is how many children we're providing services for that are either blind or have vision issues, significant vision issues. But we feel the population is twice that, so at least half of that population is not receiving services because the parent or the child or whomever doesn't know that there is a vision problem, and they don't know how to access services. So this seems to me, again, a very similar problem in that if we don't know where all the resources are, that would be the Department of Health, then there's not really, and even the school districts, there's not a way to get that information to the parents, and they're just struggling to find some solutions on their own. So if we are going to address the limited access, first of all, we need to know where access is and where the gaps are for access to address that. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. You are going to then get us the map that was requested by the senator as far as what that population, where those locations are that these 102 are from. And then can you get us some information with regard to where we think there really specifically are some services, because then we've got to figure out how to address the gaps. And quite frankly, one of the things that we're going to probably have to look at is what's available through virtual. Mm-hmm. That's not ideal. Do we know if there's any barrier with regard to insurance?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, I know of several families that have nonverbal autistic children. And they had that early diagnosis, so the children weren't babbling, they were not communicating in a manner that would fit benchmarks. So by 2 years old, once the diagnosis of the autism was there as well, then these families were provided, and it was paid for through insurance, but someone was coming to the house and providing the whole family with ASL training. The child, siblings, and parents. So is there for some reason a barrier that that's not being provided for children that have been diagnosed through that very initial test of being either deaf or having, bilateral differences or hard of hearing in some manner?
I do not know the answer to that at all. I can say that the School for the Deaf, we do have a deaf mentor program, and we have a family signs Kansas program that is virtual, and we do provide those. And it's up to the parents. We advertise through the schools, through the Tiny K networks, and those are free. But as far as like an insurance company providing that, I don't know. And I also don't know like who would be providing the ASL instruction, because that is one of our limitations is people to provide the ASL instruction, whether it be in person or virtual.
And I would think the requirement for that would be different depending on age. So if you're starting that instruction for, let's say, a 2-year-old, the realm of words or messages being assigned would be very different from a child that was 8 years old, 10 years old, as far as ASL. Senator Petty.
I appreciate some of the points you brought up. I'm just wondering if we could reach out to the Department of Health and Environment, and because you mentioned them a couple of times, and ask them if, like concerning new parents, if there's any specific information that goes out
Right.
from the Department of Health and Environment, or how, well, just ask them if they do that.
And actually, I saved our agenda from this morning, so I know a gentleman that's going to get a call. I'll reference him by 3 different names, but he will be getting a call to make sure, because it is all about the coordination of that. And it has to be, if we are going to serve all Kansas kids and all Kansas families, it has to be about more than just, well, we did the test. Doing the test is just the initial step. It is, what are we doing beyond that? And there seem to be still too many questions, unanswered pockets. So at this point, when we think of the development of language for all people, every year that passes by that we don't start intervening with the notion that it's limited access. If we don't change the fact that it's limited, it's another year that that child, that family doesn't have those services. So I think that is very much concerning. I'm not seeing any other questions. I do so appreciate your presentation today. On the one hand, I'm heartened in 2 ways. I'm heartened that the population of who is being assessed is growing because we need more numbers. I'm heartened that we did have 20 of the 102 that are meeting, but we all know that that's not good enough. 20% is not good enough of just this small sample. So I appreciate that. And did I see, is one of our attendees wanting to make a comment? That will be fine. And I am needing then our interpreter, please, to move to the microphone. Mr.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Robert Cooper. I'm the Executive Director for the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm on the advisory board for Sound Beginnings and the EHDI, Early Detection and Identification. I've been on that for the past 8 years, so I know the process in terms of what happens at the hospital. The hospital identifies the child through that newborn hearing screening, and then based on whether they've passed or failed that screening, parents are provided information and given follow-up contact information for that family. They don't want to overwhelm the family. They give them just that brief synopsis. Then the Department of Health and Environment follows up within the next few weeks to be sure that they have a checklist of information. You know, have you talked with an audiologist? Have you talked with a pediatrician? So on and so forth. Then at the second screening test, if the child fails that second screening, some of the tests are inconsequential. They're not clear. If that's true, they need to have a third test. And then at the conclusion of that, if they failed the screening again, then they're given a binder full of a plethora of resources and processes. Information about understanding hearing loss, information about communication options. What are those resources? Who are the contact individuals for that? Information related to tiny case services as well as referrals. And then information is also sent to KSD's Sound Start program and the tiny case. So then both can provide follow-up. So the state has a system where if there hasn't been any follow-up or contact within 6 months, they will seek out those families to follow up until the families say we are opting out of contact, and then they stop contact. So it's my understanding that if 98% of the children who are screened when they're born, 87% have follow-up contact. So that's leaving a very small percentage, about 11%, that we're still struggling to identify or follow up with. And many of those are perhaps born not at a hospital, but through midwife services. So 6 or 7 years ago, there was a low number, but now we have quite a high number. And they are in contact with Tiny K or an assessment program now. So that would be a Sound Start program. So that would be the information that I wanted to share with you in the committee today. Thank you so much.
So I just want to follow up, make sure we heard what was said. So once the second screening has been completed, the Kansas Department of Health provides them with a listing of resources. Okay. So I will make sure, though I don't think that the Kansas Department of Health has come to testify in our committee before. Before we are unable to have committee hearings in this committee, I don't know that we're going to have time to have them come in, but I will make the request for that material. I think that we need to be looking at that together, because if the response is to improve this, there's limited access to language and communication. Even if they're providing them with the list, if they really can't readily access it, we need to determine what the hurdle is. Is it proximity? Is it funding? Is it that we just don't have enough people that can provide that service? We've got to figure that out, because I don't think I've ever seen KDHE address this issue other than we provide the testing. I don't think they've ever come forward and said, we don't have enough people in the state that can provide these services. And that would be an important follow-up. We get reports from hospitals about if they're understaffed and things like that, but I don't think that we've ever had that direct reporting coming from anyone about the shortage or what the real needs are to have more access for that language and communication, particularly the ASL. So,
Madam Chair,
yes.
may I make a few more comments or no?
Yes, you can.
Well, I agree. I'm very thankful for this dialogue. I do appreciate it. And I think we all agree that there does need to be collaboration. It's not just a one silo, one agency handling it. And so we welcome that as well. And we also do appreciate being recognized that we are the experts in this field. I mean, even myself, being in this field, working at the School for the Deaf, I still couldn't even answer some of these questions, that were related. And so I don't expect everybody who works in early intervention to know this information either. So I do appreciate this dialogue and look forward to some collaboration.
I so appreciate that, and thank you for being here. And as a follow-up report for the committee, because when we did have the hearing for the school for the blind, the concern was, again, that half of the population wasn't being served. So I did meet with several folks, and they're working, so the family practice physicians, pediatricians, as well as the ophthalmologists and optometrists are going to be working together to see what it is that they can do to help make sure that there is a consistent, if you will, almost like a bookmark that has where those resources are. And they intend to also work with the different school districts to see if perhaps a simple vision screening could be done at, help me out, kindergarten roundup, and then be able to provide that same bookmark to parents if they think that maybe there needs to be a follow-up, if there's an issue of not having insurance or not being able to afford a screening, a follow-up test with an optometrist or ophthalmologist, let them know the different organizations that are out there that would fund that, or if there's a need for glasses or some type of vision assistance that they would provide also, contact the local Lions Club that helps provide glasses for kids. So a budget hearing ended up with 4 different groups coming together saying, what can we do to make sure families are directed toward the main resource to help those kids. So looks like as we continue to gather information, I will reach out to the Department of Health, find out what it is that they are handing out so that we can continue to bring the right people together so that this is worked on. Not, this is what the School for the Blind does, and this is what the Department of Health does, but there's communication between those two, but also communication going out to school districts as well. So thank you so much for being here. We'll watch for that follow-up information. If you simply get that to Cindy, she'll make sure that the committee gets it.
Thank you very much.
Committee, thank you for your participation today, and we are adjourned.